Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Hazy Talk. What does it say? It's some cheesy name for it. Yeah, thanks for coming. Thanks for coming to the conference. We're excited. It's bigger and better than last year. Hopefully you agree. We have three panelists who I'd say make great hazy beer or hoppy beer. I don't know. Matt Kohlen from Superflux. John Follinsbee from Backcountry Brewing. And Julia Hanlon from Steamworks. So I didn't bring a PowerPoint or anything. I just brought an email full of questions. So that's how we're going to roll on this. I guess, I don't know, it's more like a open question, but what is a hazy IPA, and where does the line get drawn between like a traditional Northwest IPA? Is there a border between the two? Is there a certain amount of haze? What would you say is like a hazy IPA? Go for it.
Do I have to go first?
Yeah, I'm going to say Matt goes first.
Okay.
Don't always make me go last.
There you go.
Yeah, I don't know. Okay, I can speak loud. I don't know. Like, there's such a wide range. You know, a typical West Coast IPA, you dry hoppy, you have a bit of chill haze. Some of these newer ones, and you pour it out, and it's basically milk. So like, there's just this massive range. So I would say like, typically anytime you're doing a larger dry hop somewhere in fermentation, you're gonna get a certain level of haze that is undeniable, and you basically can't get rid of it, and it's not gonna drop out. So that's probably where the line is drawn, maybe. I don't know if anyone agrees with that. Yeah, cool.
John?
Yeah, I mean, I pretty much agree with that. I think a lot of it depends on kind of what yeast strain you're using as well, as that has a huge effect on how much haze remains in the beer post-process. So for us, a lot of our West Coast IPAs are hazy or have some degree of haze, and it's just like Matt said, it's due to ridiculously high dry hopping rates. It's not something that we're really kind of trying to create. It's more of just like a byproduct of the process. And depending on what we're making, whether it's a West Coast IPA or an East Coast IPA, there is a level of haze, and it tends to vary depending on yeast strain, for the most part, in our beers anyway.
Everyone can hear? Is that good? Audio, yeah? Louder? Yeah. Hug that mic next time. I guess also is bitterness, as you get to certain IBUs.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think one of them are, I mean, other than obviously being hazy, one of the features I think is a little bit more balanced versus like a typical American IPA. Less balanced, like straight towards super, you know, resiny bitterness, and more towards like, you know, lower bitterness levels, a little bit more malt balance, that kind of thing. So.
And then they seem to be extremely popular, so I think it's probably because of the lower bitterness and.
Yeah, I think they're more approachable. I mean, my mom doesn't like to drink an American IPA, but she likes hazy IPAs. So if that's a benchmark for something, then my mom likes it.
My mom doesn't like any of my beer. So I guess one of the biggest things when you're going for a hazy beer or a Northeast or a New England or whatever you call them is the retention of the haze. How do you guys go about keeping this haze in suspension? What happens if it drops out?
Yeah, I would say yeast strain is massive. We've kind of used the same yeast for years, so we're used to it and we know what to expect. But we use an English ale strain, London 3, which I assume everyone uses, or most people use. And I've used Kohlen before, and that it seems to drop everything out a lot faster. So you said what happens is, you know, you have a great beer, first day in the can, 4 weeks later you open it up and it's bright. and you have this big ass sludge at the bottom, which is delicious. But, you know, it's for the average consumer, they don't know that's delicious, and it doesn't look appealing. So, yeah, yeast strain, big time.
Yeah, like I said, like yeast strain is definitely a huge part of what affects like the level of haze in the beers that we make. We've cycled through 3 different strains since we've been open for the last year and a half. We used London 3, which is what we currently use. We've used Kohlen, and we've also used 1098 from Yeast. And it took us a long time every time we changed over from one yeast strain to the next, it took us a long time to kind of relearn how to make the same beers. Because they all have such kind of like vastly different characteristics as far as like how they change the process and how they change the level of haze and a number of other factors. But yeah, like he said, it's definitely the haze level is for sure a huge part to do with the yeast strain, and it's been a big learning curve for us as well as trying to figure out our beers every time we change. It set us back quite a bit every time we do it, but it's definitely been an interesting learning experience for sure.
Yeah, I would also add that in addition to yeast strain, I think yeast management is really important. We kind of had a bit of a unique experience maybe at Steamworks with, you know, flagship IPA should look and taste like flagship IPA every time you buy a bottle of it, and we went from basically not having that brand through a huge ramp-up period, you know, at the end of 2016. And I think we were trying to make so much, and we were admittedly like cropping pretty much every amount of yeast that we were making. So we were having pretty big variation in our haze stability from like one batch to the next, even if they were brewed in the same week, because we would be cropping, you know, maybe a very flocculent population of yeast for the first tank, and then we were trying to take, you know, whatever yeast was left for the next batch, and so then we had sort of like a very non-flocculent population of yeast, and so it was just kind of all over the map, and so it was kind of an interesting experiment just because we weren't changing the recipe, but we were getting different results just on how we were managing our yeast and using our yeast. So kind of learnings out of that, I would say, is we had to be really careful about when we cropped yeast, essentially how much we're cropping, and also I guess one of the learnings that we kind of got out of it after a while was that the more yeast we had in suspension in our package, the less stable our beer haze would be. So we are actually, you know, fortunate enough to have a centrifuge, and after about a year of making flagship, we kind of made the decision to, sorry, am I talking too close?
You gotta talk close. Yeah.
You can all share one.
Oh, maybe that's why. Okay. Yeah, so we decided basically, we found that we had the best haze stability from our, you know, proteins that we were using in our mash, and also hops through dry hopping when we had the least amount of yeast in suspension in our package. So we basically had to figure out how to make our centrifuge not really work very well, just to take out the yeast fraction. So that was a bit of trial and error, but it's been a lot more stable and consistent since we started doing that.
Have you done any counts on your final product to see how much yeast is left in suspension?
That's a good question, and actually we haven't really, but you can usually tell by the kind of milkiness of the beer, and which could be all over the place. Prior to that, we were cold crashing to 0 for 10 days, which you would think would be a lot of time to get as much yeast out as possible, but it was still all over the place.
So yeast is a big factor, but I imagine the malts or flaked grains play a big portion into the haze. Do you guys specifically use certain malts, like oats, to get haze, or is that more of a sort of mouthfeel flavor component?
Yes. is the answer.
There you go.
Take this with a grain of salt, I guess. It's all based on trial and error, and that's basically it. And then maybe some literature that we have read throughout the years that kind of backs that trial and error up. But typically not a lot of flakes in anything. Usually a higher protein base malt, like in the 11.5 to 12% range. And then white wheat, almost always at about 15 to 20% for us. We just find like kind of that lower mass protein, mixed with that dry hop, that polyphenol dry hop interaction, that kind of is the best stabilizer for us. I've done back-to-back beers with 20% base malt and then 20% just flaked oats. The other beer, just 20% white wheat. That was the only change. The entire process was identical. One beer was pretty bright and the other was just extreme level of haze. So that kind of backed up what I thought and what I've read. But then again, we've done a blend of 15% wheat malt and 15% flaked wheat or flaked oats, and it's super hazy as well. So I don't know. I change my mind every day. Ask me again next year and I'll have a totally different answer, very likely.
For us, yeah, I mean, malt is really more of something we think about in terms of mouthfeel. It's not really a consideration in the recipe building process for driving haze, just because haze is not really something that one of the ways we kind of try to mitigate the kind of the snow globe effect on our beers is to pay a lot of attention to the cycle times in the brewery. So we do a lot of projections to make sure that we're running out of beer just as we're making more beer. And obviously there's like, you lose control when it leaves the brewery, but we try and make sure that our beer gets consumed incredibly quickly. And so that's one of the ways we mitigate that these kind of variances in haze and then drop out. And then, but yeah, like I said, as far as malt goes, we use a lot of Thomas Fawcett malted oats in our beers. It's super easy to work with. It's got a giant kind of sunflower seed husk on it, which makes lautering reasonable when you're using a high percentage of it. And it's really more, like I said, it's for mouthfeel rather than for haze. For us, what we've noticed is just haze is kind of predicated upon the volume of dry hopping, and we've made a lot of beers that are heavy on Fawcett oat malt that haven't been dry hopped heavily, and they drop out pretty bright. But as soon as you got hops in the mix, they're insanely hazy, and for us it hasn't really been a problem. But like I said, I think that might be due to how quickly we try and turn our beers around and how the volumes of the beer that we make, so that we have kind of a new batch coming in when the old batch is kind of on its way out.
Yeah, for us, we're using, we've had similar problems using flaked grains actually with beers dropping clear. So it's not an experiment that I've gone back to. We've just avoided flaked oats and things like that in favor of malted oats. And we're using, between oats and wheat, we're using about 15%. Again, partially for mouthfeel, and then probably not really having anything to do with haze. We have a small amount of dextrin malt in there as well, mostly for body and mouthfeel.
So mouthfeel is a big factor in these beers, right? And water chemistry, I find, plays a lot into that with the calcium chloride. How do you guys modify your water if you do? Are you putting tons of chloride in?
Okay, I use, I mean, I kind of like to geek out on water chemistry. It seems like a little bit boring, but I think it's important. For us, I find the best balance for the hazy beers is definitely the balance on the side of chloride. Like the ratio it's definitely more chloride than it is sulfate. But I also like to restrain the amounts of chloride and sulfate in the beer. We're doing probably just over 100 ppm of chloride, and I think 75 ppm sulfate roughly. And that seems to be the flavor, gives us the flavor that we like. I know you can definitely go higher, but for us, I find it just gets a little bit minerally, I guess.
For us, we kind of, when it came to salts, there's a lot of anecdotal information on the internet about what is and isn't good as far as ratios and that kind of stuff. And we've done a bunch of experimentation in the brewery with like what is reasonable and what's kind of like industry standard, and kind of trying to push the limits of what we can add and what it'll do. And I think we found the outside limit for chloride for sure. We've gone pretty crazy with ppms for that, probably in the range of like 4 or 5 times what Julia just mentioned. You do definitely hit a point where we find the beer start to get like almost salty tasting. But we kind of moved away from using sulfate entirely, unless it was kind of made sense for the particular beer that we were making at the time. So right now we're pretty much exclusively using chloride, and I'm thinking we're probably in the 300, 400 ppm range for a lot of the stuff that we make. But yeah, that's kind of where we're at right now.
Yeah, same as Julia, like in the 1-to-1 ratio for us, about 100 parts. One of the bigger things I think we've been focusing on lately, I mean, our beers are not incredibly soft. We like a bit of brightness. Personal thing, I guess. But for some of that softness is looking at your mash pH. For some of our clear beers, we're dialing that into a lower number that kind of will express that raw hop character. But for the hazier stuff, we're trying to bump that pH way back up into the, let's say, like 5-7 range. And I don't know if that's a good idea or not, but it ends up having, you're dry hopping these so much, it ends up having this just softer, rounder everything without going crazy on the salt side. The more and more salt additions, we've maxed stuff out as well, and you just keep increasing that calcium, with everything you use, and that, that degrades protein right there. So it was, at least from my experience, I found it was impacting, the haze stability and maybe dropping out too fast. Again, there's likely nothing to back that up, just a couple of trial and error sort of things. So.
I would also just add that make sure you know what salts you're using, because there's a lot of different forms of the salts out there, and if you're just using, a water calculator on most brewing websites or pro brewer, it's only specific to one type of salt. So, for example, like we use anhydrous calcium chloride. There's dihydrous, there's hexahydrous. That all affects how many ppm you're actually going to get in your beer. So.
Touching on mouthfeel more, because I find mouthfeel is pretty much everything in these beers. I guess the last component is carbonation. Like, is there a certain range you guys go for?
Yeah, we go very low, or not very low, but pretty low. Kind of the standard. It'll drop, the stronger the beer gets, we'll drop it just a little bit, but an average, say a 6.5% beer will be in the 2.3 range. We also fill our cans incredibly high, so we're not losing any of that in the package. So when I say 2.3, that's what we're getting in the tank, and it usually ends up being about 2.3 in the can. And then for the lighter beers, it'll be up in the 2.5 range, and the stronger ones like 2.2, something like that. I don't know if that's standard or not.
We've kind of been doing something similar. It's a little scary to drop the carbonation down too low in beers, just for kind of blowback from the market as far as people complaining about beers being flat. In the brewery, though, we found that in sensory trials, we all like our beers to be lower in CO2, similar to what Matt was talking about. 2.3 and even as low as 2.2 is kind of where we find the sweet spot. That being said, it still makes me nervous putting beer into packages that low. So we're generally packing like between 2.3 and 2.4, but we've kind of been incrementally decreasing that over time to kind of like slowly change the beer so that there isn't kind of any noticeable variance as the CO2 level does drop down into a range that we like it in.
I guess I'm in the minority here. We're not doing any high carbonation, but we're more around 2.5 volumes.
Cool. I do 2.4. 2.4. That's what I do. What else do I have on my list of questions? Yeah, so you talked about some of the yeast strains you use. Have you guys experimented with anything outside of Kohlen or London 3? And if not, I guess, how do you get these yeasts to work for you? Like temperature-wise, do you ramp it up to get some more of these fruity esters?
I want to hear about 1098.
Oh, yeah. I mean, we started trying 1098. We started with London 3 actually, and back then we were making different beer, and it didn't really work for what we were trying to do. We've since changed our process significantly, but the yeast we used for most of last year was 1098. It's a much cleaner yeast strain. It's way more flocculent than Kohlen and London 3. It's also kind of the interaction with the yeast and the hops isn't quite as intense, and so we eventually moved away from it. The second yeast strain we ended up moving to was Kohlen, which I had familiarity with before moving over to Backcountry. But we found that yeast was incredibly difficult to control and inconsistent. And when we started fermentation dry hopping our beers, whatever's happening in that process, whether it's the enzymes and the hops that are breaking down the sugars in the beer, we couldn't control like the finishing gravity on beers made with Kohlen. It was just dropping way too low for us, and so that's kind of why we moved over to London 3, and that's currently where we're at. We have a lot more control as far as where we get our beers to finish.
Yeah, we're using Kohlen at Steamworks, and I think for the fermentation profile, particularly for obviously Flagship IPA is the biggest brand that we use with that yeast strain. It's a little bit of a drier finish that we're going for. It's probably a little bit even on the northwest side of a hazy IPA, I would say. So we kind of have the fermentation profile set up to still have kind of a clean yeast character, but it still develops a lot of esters. So we do like a 2-step temperature profile through that fermentation. And if you smell it pre-dry hop, it already smells like juice. So I really like the ester profile with the way we've been doing that. So.
Speaking of a fermentation dry hop, how do you get yeast out of there when you put all those hops in? Do you just have to find a big brewery to give you yeast? Or do you just reuse the yeast with hops in it? Is it a conspiracy by Big Beer to ruin all your yeast? What do you find the benefits with the biotransformation, and how do you deal with chucking hops in your yeast slurry?
Yeah, we won't reuse yeast from the heavily dry hop beers. We just plan our schedule to make a cleaner beer. We use the same yeast for our clear beers as well, so it's basically a yeast starter, and we just slide one of those in when we need to prop some up, and that's it.
We're the same. We don't repitch yeast that's been fermentation dry hopped. We have a beer that's in our lineup, our pale ale. That's kind of our sacrificial beer. We don't fermentation dry hop that, and so that's kind of where we get a lot of our clean yeast from. And then also with our kind of flagship IPA Widowmaker, we fermentation dry hop a portion of it, and then we blend it back together with the clean side, so that we have clean yeast coming off of that beer as well. But that's how we kind of get around that.
Yeah, that is a good idea. Yeah, we tried a couple of experiments with fermentation dry hop and then cropping, and it just didn't work. the viability was really low, and we just had mostly hops. So we actually, we don't dry hop during fermentation. We crash to our dry hopping temperature. We crop basically 24 hours later and dry hop right after that. And we do have quite a lot of yeast in suspension at that time. So I don't know if my theory is correct, but I feel like we still get some benefit of biotransformation from the yeast in suspension.
On the topic of biotransformation, is there any hop strains you guys have found that do well with this? I mean, you put a hop in and then it changes aroma, preferably something fruity. Is there hops you found, it's a tough question, but that do well with a biotransformation, fermentation dry hop? Or do you just use your typical ones you'd be doing other beer?
We actually, our brew pub just brewed a beer, a hazy pale ale with Chinook dry hop with barbarian yeast, and it was crazy. It was awesome, which I would not have expected necessarily with Chinook. To be.
Yeah, we use Columbus and Cascade in almost every dry hop, and also just on the hot side as well, and they're fantastic.
Our kind of favorite hops to put in the fermentation side are Columbus and Mosaic. We find they kind of change the most. They change the varietal character the most in a positive way. We've also found that like kind of a byproduct of the different varietals you add during fermentation, it drives attenuation in a different way. We find certain varietals drive it further than others. And so that's something that we've learned to account for over time. Mosaic being one of the ones that's the most aggressive as far as breaking down the sugar in the beer and causing the fermentation to go further.
If I could get some time.
That's crazy.
I guess talk a bit about hop creep, which is a new topic people kind of been bringing up, and the formation of diacetyl with the dry hopping. Have you guys looked into that too much? Have you changed any of your procedures with this kind of new information that's kind of coming up?
Yes, definitely. We now check our diacetyl post every dry hop, and we find, I would say 90% of the time there's not diacetyl, but that's usually 3 days post dry hop we check. But then there's that 10% of the time where we do see it, and in almost all our beers, we do see a hop creep and attenuation, and it does seem very varietal dependent. I was just saying we've seen a huge drop, in particular with Simcoe.
To mitigate the diacetyl, because I can't smell it. I'm kind of nose blind to it. Julie knows this, but what we do basically is in order to mitigate that, we just run our dry hop schedules out a fair bit longer than we normally would, just to play on the safe side and make sure that we get the cleanup that we're looking for.
Yeah, same thing. So just a much longer, just being extra safe, extra long dry, just make sure that everything's done. We don't have the tools to measure diacetyl. Same as John, I have a tougher time picking it up, but I haven't seen any issues yet.
Hopefully next year we'll get a hop creep talk. I know someone in Yakima who's got a pretty good talk on it, so exploding cans. So hopefully next year we can get him up here to talk on a hop creep. Do you guys use any stabilizers for your haze, or is that just cheating? I use a stabilizer. It's not cheating.
I don't know what that is.
Like a Biofine, I think, or Tantal A.
No.
There you go. You guys know?
No.
Maybe it is cheating.
We've used that stuff before, but it doesn't seem to have a great deal of effect on the beers that we're making, because there's like the Biofine seems to attack the yeast, whereas the we don't really have the equipment or the money to invest in the things that attack polyphenol. So it hasn't really done. We've tried it and it's done nothing for us.
Yeah, we use Channel A from Y East. We throw it in the dry hop. Seems to work really well. We get good stability, so keep using it. So shelf life. Everyone worries about the shelf life of hazy beers. It's got a lot of polyphenol and protein content. How do you find your shelf life is with these beers? Do you do anything to try and extend the shelf life? Or do you just kind of keep it cold, drink it quick? That's every beer.
Yeah. Ideally, keep it cold and drink it quick. But I think with any beer, anything you do to mitigate oxidation is going to help with hazy beers too. So doing everything you can to mitigate dissolved oxygen, storing your beer cold for as long as it's in your control, that is, and trying to not have too much inventory out there in the market.
Yeah, same. Just the O2 is the biggest thing. That's why draft is always that much more fantastic usually. Also, our cans, we basically cap on beer, which financially is not great at all. But our total package oxygen is fantastic, and it's kind of undeniable. So we just made the call to fill them to the brim. I mean, our carb level's lower, so we can get away with that, and you're not gonna have stuff spraying you in the face. But yeah, we found, if you can keep, your total package at a very low level, it should last a while, especially if it's being kept cold, but that's not always the case. So
478 ml cans.
I would say 500. Have you seen our prices?
Yeah, I would pretty much echo what both of these guys have already said. Keep it cold, and we also fill our cans incredibly high. We also have, for a small brewery anyway, we have pretty large cold storage, and we're about to invest a whole lot more money into an even larger cold storage so that we can keep every bit of packaged beer that we have on site cold at all times until it leaves the brewery. And as far as degradation goes, we notice, without really knowing and having the equipment to measure DO, just because it's so incredibly expensive, we notice, and we kind of do our best as well to try and keep it as low as possible, but we notice degradation in 3 weeks, even when it's kept cold. I mean, it's easier to notice when you're drinking your beer all the time. But I remember from trials we did at Steamworks with Julia, we noticed degradation in 2 weeks at room temperature, and then at 6 weeks when cold. So I'm not sure it varies from beer to beer, but that's kind of what we found out from before, if I remember correctly.
It's a bit better now, but
yeah. So all these beers are dry hopped. It's not an IPA if you don't dry hop it. Maybe, I think so. With dry hopping rates, there's got to be a point where you can't put more hops in. What kind of range do you go for on the low end and high end, and where do you feel you're just wasting money? If you can use grams per hect, that's what I use, so it's easy for me.
Grams?
Grams per hectoliter, or kilograms, that's my rap name. Yeah, or pounds per barrel, or whatever, but preferably a metric unit.
Yeah, we probably, I wouldn't be surprised to learn if we were the least aggressive dry hoppers of the three of us here, but we use about 0.6 kilograms per hectoliter. I think I did the math right, which is 1.3 pounds per barrel, I think. So it's not too aggressive, but we can go higher for sure, but I actually don't think it gives us a lot more. I think the scale of what you get starts to level off.
For us, it depends on, some of the IPAs we make are not fermentation dry hopped, so the rates are a bit lower on those. We're looking at about 1 kilogram per hec on those. For kind of your single IPAs, and then the ones we call double dry hopped are generally in the 1.5 to 2 kilogram range, and then double IPAs are kind of the sky's the limit. We've gone up to 3 in that range, plus or minus. But that's kind of where we're at.
Yeah, same thing. Kind of depends on the beer and what we want out of the beer, but yeah, 1.5 kilos per heck is kind of average, and we've gone up to the 3+ range. Yeah, it's fantastic. It's great.
It's interesting. I was reading an article in the Brewers Association about the style guidelines for Hazy IPA, and it had dry hopping rates starting at 3 kilos per barrel and then going up.
That was the requirement?
Not a requirement.
Okay.
I think it was just, it was an article about hazy IPAs, and I was like, starting at 3?
That's crazy.
Yeah.
Well, that's probably why there's so many hop companies now. It's because you guys use so much hops. I kind of touched on most of the questions I kind of pulled from my head. And we got about 20 minutes left. I think we'll go to the floor to see if anybody has questions about these beers. Who's making, I guess, a hazy, or whatever you want to call it, out there? Is everyone making one now? This is all pretty well. Yeah, does anyone have any questions for the panelists regarding this style of beer? Or I guess the hopping end of it as well. We do a microphone over there, or just yell it? Just yell it.
You touched on yeast management, but can you talk a little bit about pitching rates for ester production, specifically for the yeast strains that you're using?
Sure. We did some experimentation with that, starting with 1 million cells per degree Plato, per mil per degree Plato, and which is sort of like a high pitching rate for us for anything. And then we kind of worked our way backwards and found that around 0.5 million per mil per degree Plato is ideal for us for ester production.
I would say we're kind of doing something very similar as far as pitch rate goes. And then it's on the lines of ester production. We've started to ramp our temperatures up past ranges that's recommended, and we're kind of pushing it all the time, and we have really yet to see any kind of negative effect from it. And we do see more ester kind of production from that as well. I mean, oftentimes people are kind of like in the trying to think, I'm American, so I'm trying to think in Celsius. 20C is kind of like an average ale yeast kind of fermentation range, and we're pushing it starting there and pushing higher into 24, 25, pretty warm, and we've seen good results from it.
Yeah, same as John. So definitely under pitching based on what the yeast companies would recommend, and super warm temperatures. So starting in the 19 range and kind of letting it free rise, finish in the 25 to sometimes 30 range for the yeast strain that we use, and yeah.
I would also add that oxygenation rates are important for ester production, so we're kind of erring on the low side with oxygenation if you have the ability to measure that somehow, without too much compromise on your fermentation health, but that's an important factor in addition to pitching rate.
We're recording it, so I'm going to repeat the question just for the people going back listening. So it was basically, what do you do for your pitch rates in order to increase ester production? So, next question, in the back. I'll repeat it.
Hi there. Just wondering if you can touch on sort of techniques or equipment that you use successfully to dry hop your beers. And on the flip side, for your conditioning, how have you been successful in avoiding hop particulate through carrying over to packaged product or consumer glasses?
So that was a lot. So what kind of equipment do you guys use for dry hopping, and how do you avoid some of this hop particulate in the final products?
Yeah, so we do most of our dry hopping is a single charge usually. They are 6,500 liter tanks. We have a 6-inch butterfly valve on the top, thanks to Steel and Oak, got us onto that. and we just got a massive funnel made, so you're basically just doing this. And the second question was, what?
How do you get the hops out of there?
The hops out of the tank?
How do you deal with the particulate?
Like in the fermenter or in the?
Just as you're taking it to your packaging or to your can.
Okay. We typically leave our beers in the conditioning tank for about a week before we package. Found at about 3 to 4 days, everything is out of there that we want out of there. Standpipe as well.
Yeah, we're pretty much the same. We kind of we generally dry hop in a single charge unless it's a great deal of hops, then we'll break it up. We go through a pour in the top of our tanks just like Matt does. And then as far as getting particulate out, it's really just time and temperature.
Yeah, for us, we're using the Newlands hop eggs, which is like basically just a mixing tank that has a really big mixer on it to mix up hops. So we hydrate the hops in the beer and then push it back into the tank, and we do a recirculation for a certain number of turns of the tank. And then we usually, like I say, wait about 3 days, do our diacetyl checks, which are just a sensory forced diacetyl test at this point. And we still transfer out of, the dry hopping is done in the fermenter, then we transfer out of the fermenter into a clean conditioning tank. Before we were centrifuging, it was 10 days at 0 in that tank with a standpipe. And then since we've been centrifuging, it's still 6 days at 0. And yeah, we pull out a lot in the centrifuge and still keep a really pretty good hazy beer. So.
Cool. Next question. Over the back.
Yeah, just wondering if you guys have any experience or opinions about using fruit pectin to retain haze.
Any experience with fruit pectin for haze? Huh? Anyone out there in the crowd? Huh? You guys ever put flour in your beer? No, you would never tell anybody either, right? Any other questions? There you go. Tim.
Yeah. What's your experience with like T45 or powder? I generally use about half for dry hop, but
So I guess pellet formats or cryo hop, I guess hop powder, and your experiences with it?
We really like T45. We're pretty aggressive with hopping, so we don't generally put any less in there. We just put a lot of T45 in. We've also used the powder, which we are not as big a fan of. We find it's really hard to deal with. You can't really dry hop with it. You kind of have to use a pump circulation method to try and get it to dissolve in the beer, which is kind of a pain. And also we found that even though they kind of say it makes for a less green beer, we found that it's a lot harder to drop out of the beer because the particulate's so much finer. And so we found that when we used it, it made beers that were a lot greener, a lot longer.
We've only experimented with it a couple of times, and mostly due to handling issues, we didn't really go with the lupulin powder or cryo hops.
Yeah, we use cryo in most beers at about 15% of the total weight.
You get bonus beer when you get the cryo hop too. We tried moving some over and get like a couple more kegs, so kind of nice. More questions?
When you're dry hopping as much as 3 kilos per heck, how is that affecting your perceived bitterness, and how are you adjusting your recipes for that?
So with the high dry hoppings, how do you deal with the increased perceived bitterness? Do you adjust recipes?
It just ends up being more bitter, usually. I think, yeah, you go to those rates, and the beer being so thick, it's just holding on to all of that particulate, so it can get pretty harsh and astringent. So just a little extra time to let that drop out. Seems fine, but I won't change any bitterness level on the hot side.
We do change our recipes depending on how much we dry hop. It's also varietal dependent. A lot of the Southern Hemisphere stuff this year, like Vic Secret and Galaxy, we found to be quite harsh and quite green when used in high percentages. So we had to kind of mitigate for that. One of the ways we do that is by dropping our bitterness hot side, and also by finishing our beers higher. It helps to balance out that kind of green, kind of like hop sting character you get when you're dry hopping at these high rates. Yeah, and a lot of times with these beers that you're going kind of like super high on, they tend to peak later in the can as well. So it's sometimes impossible to remove that green character or that hop sting, and so you'll occasionally we'll hold cans back until it's dropped out. Sometimes it's anywhere from 1 to 3 weeks before we have it in a spot where we're happy with it.
We don't dry hop that high.
I got a question. I just thought of it. We've done some decreased temperature whirlpools to kind of alleviate some of the increased bitterness with the high hot side hopping. Have you guys played with the dropping your whirlpool temp for hopping? Is there a certain temperature you go for, or how do you go about doing it?
We have tried it, yeah. Bitterness is lower. Yeah.
So it works.
So it works. Yeah, like the one, we don't typically do that.
Yeah.
Like, what are you doing, 180? Or is that Fahrenheit?
The Celsius, it boils at 100.
Okay, thank you. So cancel that.
We go down to like 85.
Yeah, so like the 90.
Or maybe like 86 or 7, because if we do a giant hop that's frozen
like
hops. Yeah, if we've made like one of those sort of lactose milkshake IPAs, would you really want to have a low bitterness? And we found you can really drop the IBUs completely by going down to sort of 85. We've looped back from our heat exchanger. So we've kind of built it into our system now that you can just go through the heat exchanger, chunk down your temperature, and like almost eliminate most of the bitterness. I find it's really hard to get any idea of IBUs you're getting from your whirlpool. So dropping your temperature almost just eliminates that variable. But yeah, try it.
We've just started kind of experimenting with it. We've kind of been slowly increasing our dry hopping rates over the last little while. As a result, we've been adjusting our recipes for it. The first thing we did, the most obvious way, obviously, is to drop the amount of hops you're putting in hot side. But I found that to be a lot, the sensory or the impact from the hot side hops to be a lot greater than I thought. I thought the percentage of hops, obviously, going on the dry hop side is higher, but I was surprised by how much the beer changed when we did that. And so we've just started experimenting with dropping our whirlpool to 85 like Graham does, and seeing what that does. We just started doing it, so I don't really have any kind of enough data points to have any kind of real reliable results yet, but it definitely does seem to drop bitterness.
Yeah, we're not doing it on any regularity, but we have done it on 2 beers, and we picked 80 and got pretty negligible IBU from that. And so we did it on the Brute IPA for obvious reasons, and a tart IPA.
You didn't see a difference though?
Question over there.
For those of you that just take hops and dump them to the top of the tank, what is the right number of days to let those hops sit in the beer for you? Are you rumbling or reserving? What do you do?
So just dropping hops on the top of the tank, how do you deal with it? Do you recirc it? Do you rumble it? You just leave it?
Depends on the beer, all 3. Yeah.
Yeah, I would say the same. It definitely depends on the beer, and for us, it also depends on the yeast strain we're using. We started using 1098 for the bulk of 2017, and during that period, we were recirculating our hops from anywhere from 1 to 4 hours in the tank with a pump, and then immediately crash chilling it afterwards to decrease our kind of turn times in the brewery. And that worked well for that yeast strain, but as soon as we moved over to Kohlen and tried that, it had a dramatic effect on the characteristics of the beer, and we could no longer do it. It created some kind of strange bond with the yeast and the hops, and we just could not get the green character to drop out of the beers. And so we changed our regime for that beer. With that strain, we no longer use that strain, and we've since moved to London 3, and we currently just pretty much going through the top, and we use a pump to mix the hops, but for just long enough to break them up, and then we'll also rumble them a day later. That's our regime.
You got fancy hop equipment.
Yeah, so we use the hop egg to get it in there, and then, well, actually at Steamworks we've done pretty much every manner of method of dry hopping that you could think of until we kind of landed on this one, which seems to work the best for us. We've gone through the top, we've done rousing, for 3 consecutive days, we've done rousing for 1 day, we've done all sorts of things, but we like the recirc the best, and we go by tank turns as opposed to number of hours, so basically the amount of times you turn the whole volume of your tank. And we just experimented with starting high and going lower and then going back up and landing on the number of turns that we like the best.
I guess an added question on that, if you're dumping hops on the top during a fermentation dry hop, how do you deal with it not rocketing out the top? I don't know if it's ever happened to you guys, but probably has.
What we do now after taking a number of beer showers at the brewery is we use our yeast brink. And actually, there's been a couple of pretty sketchy situations. We've got a lift that we go up with, but if you use London 3, it's a really aggressive yeast strain, and especially when you add hops to it, it adds those nucleation points, and then CO2 off-gassing is crazy. And so you have to be pretty damn careful when you're doing it, because the amount of CO2 that starts coming out the top of the tank, apart from like the liquid coming out, the gas coming out can be really sketchy. So now just to be safe and to make sure that, just to make sure everybody's safe in the brewery, we use a yeast brink. And the way that we do it now is we hook up a conical yeast brink to our tank, and we pull hops. We pull wort from fermenting beer from the bottom of the tank, push it into the bottom of into the cone and the yeast brink, and then out the side of the yeast brink, and we cycle that until there's no more hops coming out of the tank. Essentially, that's how we get it in.
Cool. All right. More questions? Questions? No? Got another 4 minutes. Okay. You guys just want beer. The beer starts at noon, right? At 11:56. I better stop talking then. A big round of applause for our panelists. You can do it. Yeah. Get up here, Ken.
Okay. Thank you all very much for joining us and working on this. We really appreciate it. As I said earlier, our charity of choice is BC Hospitality Foundation. We've, instead of a growler or a baseball hat or a t-shirt, we decided that we would do a donation in your name to the association, so to the foundation. So thank you very much.
Thanks.